Okay, cool. So it looks like we're recording now. So yeah, thanks again for coming. Um, I started working on like a whole um, presentation and like slide deck for talking about our Markdown today, which is like the subject of today's little workshop. But I actually like, that isn't necessarily the way that I even like to present things. And I want people to feel comfortable and to like encourage folks to just like come to these meetups and talk about like a topic that they know and just in a way that they can just talk about it like casually. So that's what I plan on doing today. So let me share my screen. That's where most of the interesting stuff is going to be happening. Okay, cool. All right, my screen should be totally visible now. And I'm going to be doing this work in our studio, which hopefully folks are familiar with. I'm happy to talk about, downloading R in our studio if that's the point that you're at also. Um, and as you can see, I have a little bit of like an outline here, and we're just gonna go through that today. So I guess first I should introduce myself a little bit, for some folks. So I'm Sean Kross. I am like a brand new staff scientist working in the data science lab here at Fred Hutch. The data science lab is what we're calling the office of the chief data officer. So Fred Hutch has a new chief data officer. His name is Jeff Leake, and I work for him directly. My background is in like computer science and that kind of thing. I just moved to Seattle from San Diego, but I am originally from the East Coast. But I really love using R, and I think that my ability to write documents in our Markdown and to use our Markdown has definitely been like a significant part of my career. And so I hope that I can share some of those experiences with you all today, and to show you how powerful of a tool it is, and what it can do for your work. So, I'm happy to just kind of dive right into it. So if if you've got RStudio open on your computer, here, I just want to check one thing. Yeah, I just want to make sure that I'm in the chat for this in case anyone wants to type something. But if you've got RStudio open on your computer, and you want to start messing around with our Markdown, we're going to make a new R Markdown file. So I'm going to come up here to File and say New File, and just say Markdown file here, right? So Markdown is kind of its own thing, which I'll get into, and R Markdown is an extension of that. So I'm going to talk about Markdown first. So Markdown is like a very lightweight, plain text sort of markup language. So, a markup language in terms of like computer programming languages that you might be familiar with is like HTML. Um, HTML is very is very complicated compared to R Markdown. Something that's nice about R Markdown is that like HTML or like any other kind of programming language or many markup languages, you write it in plain text, so you can write it right in the RStudio editor. And the idea is that you can transform R Markdown files into many different kinds of documents, and into many different kinds of products. So you can use R Markdown to create websites, to create academic papers, people have written books and have written their like PhD theses in our Markdown, and you can even use it to make like interactive websites, and even things like videos, which is people really can take the use of our Markdown to some extremes. But in in its simplest form, Markdown is just this like plain text markup language that is supposed to be readable both for people and for computers. So I'm just going to like get into writing one of these documents, one of these Markdown documents, right? So I've got this Markdown document here, and we can start writing prose like, I really need to go to the grocery store this week, and so let's make a grocery list, right? So this is just like basic prose. If you want to write headings, you can specify like the biggest heading with 1 pound sign, a slightly smaller heading with 2 pound signs. So I'm going to organize this and say like, this is my grocery list, and I need to get things from, make a subheading for each place where I want to get groceries, right? So I'm going to make a subheading for Costco and a subheading for Trader Joe's, and then I want to, of course, like make a list of things that I need at Costco, but Costco is a huge store. I want to make sure that I'm navigating Costco in the most efficient order, right? So I'm going to write kind of like a numbered list of things I need at Costco. So first I need an office chair. Next I need a big block of cheese. And then finally I need a big blanket because winter is here, as anyone knows who has stepped outside today in Seattle. Okay, so that's good for Costco. Trader Joe's is kind of a smaller store, so I'm gonna make an unordered list of things to get at Trader Joe's. So instead of numbering everything in the list, I'm just going to list each individual item with a hyphen, right? So things I need from Trader Joe's, the usual. I need eggs. I need a grapefruit sparkling water, and I need a pancake mix. Okay, cool. So I've got like a little bit of like I got my grocery list here. So now as as just a document, as a file in and of itself. Well, let me save this too. So I'm going to say grocery list.md. So for Markdown is a .md file. I'm going to save it in this RStudio project. So as a as a standalone file, this is pretty useful on its own without me turning it into anything else, right? It's easy to read. The way things that things are organized in a way that's easy to understand without me having to like take this Markdown file and compile it to anything else necessarily, right? But still in all, we can preview what it's going to look like in RStudio in other formats, right? So for example, if I wanted to turn this into a website, I could come up here in the RStudio window. Let me see if I can make this bigger. Yeah, I can make it a lot bigger. I'm going to come here to preview, and there's kind of like a drop-down menu. And so I'm going to say preview to HTML. So it's going to take this ARM Markdown file and turn it into an HTML file that I can put on the web, right? So I click that, it'll compile it, and then RStudio will give me this preview of this very simple web page, right? So it just is reproducing the information that I put into the Markdown file, but it's rendered nicely in HTML, right? If I go over to my file browser and I take a look at the HTML file, I can open it up in the RStudio editor, and you can see that this is all HTML code, right? This is pretty complicated. Let me see if I can actually get to the content of what I wrote. Yeah, so here we go. So buried under all of this HTML, we can actually find the content that I wrote here at the end of the file. But it's nice, right? Instead of having to like write all of this like verbose, complicated HTML, I just wrote a Markdown file, compiled it in RStudio to an HTML file, and now I could go put this up on the web wherever I wanted. Okay, so that is like the super basics of Markdown. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, cool. All right. By the way, if anyone does have a question at any point during this conversation, just put something in the chat or speak up, and I'm happy to talk, of course. Okay, so that's like the very, very basics of Markdown. There are more things that you can do in Markdown besides just writing paragraphs and headings and lists, but I think that we'll get into that as we talk more about our Markdown, right? So, okay, so the next, here's where we are in our outline. So the next thing I want to talk about is R Markdown, right? So R Markdown is an extension of Markdown that incorporates using R and R programming. There are people who I know who do all of their R work in an R Markdown file. They never touch like a regular .R file. All the work that they do is done in R Markdown, which just goes to show how powerful of a tool it is. And R Markdown, I would say, is like the leading plain text format computational notebook technology, right? So of course, I would say that overall Jupyter is probably the leading computational notebook technology, but you need like, you need server infrastructure, you need like kernel infrastructure. It's a very like, in order to write in a Jupyter notebook, you need like some computing that's going on in the background where, what's nice about R Markdown is that fundamentally it's just a plain text file, right? In order to compile it into other things, of course, you need some computing in order to be able to do that, but just, the file in and of itself is just a regular plain text file. So in RStudio, if we want to open up an R Markdown or create a new R Markdown file, we go to File, New File, and then we're going to click on R Markdown, and that'll open up this sort of overlay window where RStudio wants to help you create this R Markdown file, right? So I'm going to call this my analysis, and I'm even going to put my name in, and then everything else looks okay to me, and I'll talk about the details of it, of what some of these options are coming up. So I'm going to press OK, and it opens up a new R Markdown file, right? So here I'm going to save this immediately, call it my analysis.rmd. Cool. Okay, so we can see that automatically, just like by default, RStudio populates this R Markdown file with some information, right? So the first thing that I want let's look at what's familiar to us, right? So like this is like a subheading because it has 2 hash marks. These are just like some paragraphs. As you can see, you can include like links in a Markdown document and in an R Markdown document. And then we can also see that we've got some code in this document, right? This looks like, if you're familiar with R code, it looks like R code. So I'm actually going to delete this for a second and try to build up some of these R Markdown concepts from scratch. So first, let me just write a little sentence. So the first part of my analysis, right? So in Markdown and our Markdown, if you want to output, you want to display several lines of code, what you could do is you can write what's called a code chunk, right? So the syntax in Markdown for code chunks is to write 3 backticks on one line, 3 backticks on the next line, and then in between those 2 lines with 3 backticks, you can write whatever code you want, right? So let's say I wanted to write like, for my analysis, I'm gonna use the built-in R data set trees, and let's say that I want to use the tidyverse. And then I need to get with the new pipe, but I'm still old school with the old pipe. So let's say trees, tidyverse, and I want to look at, let's just actually say I want to just look at the column names of trees, right? So very, very, very simple. This code, just like reading this code is relatively straightforward. If I go to knit this, so knitting it is essentially the same thing as like previewing the document before when we were dealing with a Markdown file. If we click on this knit button, then we can see a couple things have happened, right? So, just like we typed, it says the first part of my analysis, and then in like a, fixed width coding font, it shows library tidyverse, and then it shows the code that we've written, right? So that's how we can get like code to be displayed in Markdown. But what would be really cool, right, is if we could like actually get this code to run, right? So of course that's easy to do and is like the key feature of our Markdown, is that if you want to actually like have our code be executed when you compile this R Markdown document from R Markdown into HTML or into some other kind of document format, then in front for this first set of 3 backticks, if you put 2 curly braces and then write R, then RStudio knows that you're writing R code inside of this R Markdown document, and that when you press knit, that it will run this R code and it will display, it will include the results of this R code in whatever document you're creating, right? So in this case, we're creating HTML documents, that we can share online. So all I did was I added this R in curly braces, and then I'm going to click knit. And okay, so we can see that just by adding that R in curly braces, we have like a really different output, right? So when we load library tidyverse, we get all of the usual like messaging about what the tidyverse library conflicts with and what packages it's loading. Then, as we can see, this R code actually gets executed, right? We're looking at, trees has 3 column names, girth, height, and volume. And that what would get outputted in the R console gets outputted in this R Markdown document. Okay, so that's a major like turning point in what we've been doing. Does anyone have I just want to pause to see if anyone has any questions so far. Okay, cool. Again, feel free to interrupt me when you have questions. So let's also like unpack a little bit in terms of something that I've been ignoring talking about is like the first 6 lines of this R Markdown file. So lots of R Markdown files, not necessarily every R Markdown file, but many of them, I would say most of them start with 3 hyphens, 2 lines of 3 hyphens, right? So we've got 3 hyphens here. We have 3 hyphens there. And then probably the most common, well, so what this area between these hyphens is called YAML front matter. So YAML is like another kind of data organization, data exchange language. It's probably like its closest competitor is probably something like JSON. YAML tends to be a little bit more human readable, but not always. And the idea is with this YAML front matters section of an R Markdown document is that you can specify basically like some metadata about the document itself. And depending on what you are compiling the R Markdown document into, that will influence, it'll have an effect on the final results. So, for example, probably the most common, or one of the most common kinds of parameters that you're going to see in this YAML front matter is this output parameter. And that is specifying specifically that this document is going to be, when it's knit or when it's compiled, I'm kind of using those terms interchangeably. Knitting it is like an RStudio kind of term. So when this document is knit, it's going to be knit into an HTML document. And not just any HTML document, but there is a library in R, which I encourage you to download, called R Markdown. And R Markdown has a function called HTML document, right? So when we go to knit this document, R knows to look at this output parameter in the YAML front matter. When it sees HTML document, it actually interprets this as a function object. So it knows that it is a function from our Markdown. Similarly, we could say, our Markdown : HTML document to be specific that we want, this particular function from the R Markdown package, and it would work the same way. And then given that it is an HTML document, these parameters, title, author, and date, are inputs to this HTML document function, right? In other words, this HTML document function is expecting that there's a possibility that you're going to specify the title, the author, and the date. And of course, if you do that, then it's always going to put that title, author, and date information at the same place in the output document in this HTML file, right? So there are different kinds of outputs. Those require those may require different kinds of metadata, for you to type in different kinds of metadata in the YAML front matter of this R Markdown document. But the HTML document output type is pretty simple, right? So, for example, I could get rid of this and just say HTML document is the output. And when I go to knit it, then it doesn't display the title or the date or my name or anything, because those are optional parameters, right? Those parameters aren't required in order to use the HTML document output type. So this is I think that this is really not trivial. I think that actually this is like what I would consider one of the main criticisms of R Markdown as a technology, is that in 12 lines of code here, we're looking at 3 different syntaxes, right? So, first there is, 3 different syntaxes and really 3 different technologies, right? So there is like there's YAML, which is its own its own data specification language in the front matter. Then after the YAML, you have interspersed Markdown, which is its own markup kind of language. And then of course you're writing R code, right? So, so even in, this kind of a simple basic document, you are dealing with with three separate um, kinds of syntaxes. But I think that it's, usually the YAML part of it is simple enough and kind of prescribed enough that, and also, Markdown is a simple enough syntax to learn that, the goal, the design goal of our Markdown is that hopefully you're just worrying about getting your R code to work as you would be if you were writing it in an R file, right? Okay, let me see where we are. Okay, cool. So we talked a little about R code chunks. Um, Again, if you have questions, this is a lot of information. None of these notebook technologies are simple, right? This is even though this is relatively few lines of code, it's still complicated stuff. So if you have a question now, please feel free to interrupt me. And if you think of something a week from now, feel free to message me on Slack, send me an email. I'm really happy to talk about it and passionate about this stuff. So, okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about what you can do in these R code chunks. So that's what these you can see that RStudio has darkened lines 7 through 12 here. This area is where you're writing R code. This R code gets executed, and this is an R code chunk, right? So let's write more complicated R code. Let's write some more complicated R code, right? So it's funny. I want to go execute trees over here in the console, and the default behavior in our Markdown when you're using it in RStudio is actually to, whenever you execute R code, if it is displaying or if the result of the R code is a data frame or a visualization, it'll show it within the document. Some people really like this functionality. So, there's kind of a very lightweight GUI here where I can look at the data frame. I'm kind of too old school to like this. Lots of people really love it, but I haven't turned it off yet because I'm working on a new machine. But if I look at this trees data frame over here, okay, so I want to make let's say I want to do a ggplot, and I should load this first. It's not happy because of dbplyr. Hopefully that doesn't matter. I want to do a ggplot with the relationship between girth and volume, and this is going to be a geo point, right? Probably don't need much more than this. Yeah, as you can see, this shows up in the inside of this our Markdown file. And yeah, that's fine. Cool. So let's here I'm going to add some of that YAML back. So I'm going to say analysis of trees. And then if I knit this, you'd probably guess that here's my title, analysis of trees. I just wrote some prose. The first part of my analysis, library tidyverse, produces all this messaging, and then I have my R code here, and of course this produces this figure, which is automatically added to the output document, which is nice. There are a couple of options that I can, that I can add to these R code chunks. So the first thing, one of the first thing that you probably want to do with your R code chunks is to name them. The reason you want to name them, so here I'm going to name this one girth and volume. You can imagine that when you've written, I'm gonna add a subheading here, call this part 1. You can imagine that like when you have an R Markdown document and it's several hundred lines, if you're trying to navigate that document, a nice way to be able to navigate it is to use this menu in RStudio, where you click here and it'll automatically here. So like, let's say, let me just copy and paste this just to make this document longer and say part 2. Let's make this like, here, I'm going to call this, because it's girth and volume, right? I'm going to call this GV point because we're making a G on point. Here, I'm going to do something that, would not be useful to this analysis, but make a G on line. Yeah, which doesn't make any sense given this data, but whatever, it's two different, just to illustrate those two different kinds of outputs. Okay, so if I had like a larger document here, it's easy to navigate this document using this little menu down here where I can scroll to the top. I can scroll to individual subheadings. It'll take me right to the line. It also, under those subheadings, it shows the chunk, so it'll automatically populates this with chunk 1, meaning like the first R code chunk, and then this GV point is what I named the chunk, obviously, right? So if you name your chunks, it makes it very easy to like navigate this menu and to like get back to an R code chunk that you were working on. So naming your chunks is important. There are several chunk options. So you can see I typed a comma and then a space, and all of these options come up that RStudio automatically populates for you, to be able to type them in and spell them correctly in an easy way. Some of these R code chunks that I use most often, I have them listed here. So one of them is include. So if I say include equals true or false, the default is that include equals true. If I say include equals false, then what happens is that this code is hidden. So like the code itself will not be put into the final document. And the output of the code is also hidden. So if I change this to code equals false, you'll see that for part 1, the code doesn't make it into the document. The output graph doesn't make it into the document. However, the code does run. Here, let me add part 3. I'm going to call this variable assignment, right? So what I'm going to do up here is in part 1, I'm not only going to make this graph, but I'm also going to assign a variable, right? I'm going to assign x the value 5, and then down here I'm going to just report the value. I'm just going to print the value for x. Right. The reason I'm doing this is to show that if I do include equals false, even though you won't see this code and you won't see the output of this ggplot, this line of code is going to be run, and you'll be able to see that this line of code was executed because the code that you run within these individual chunks is preserved across a single R Markdown document. So therefore, this variable assignment will show up in part 3 of this R Markdown document. Okay, so all that said, let me knit this. And you'll see I did include equals false. So as you can see, neither the code nor the output of the ggplot made it into the final document. I didn't touch the chunk options for part 2, so the code and the output are here. And then you can see that, just the code for X and then the resulting value 5 got printed, showing that the code in part 1 did actually get run, even though it didn't appear in the final document. Okay, so that's include. Similarly to include, there's eval, right? And I wonder if this will actually cause an error. So the default is eval equals true, but if I say eval equals false, then this code will be displayed in the final document, but the output of the code will not be displayed because this code actually doesn't get run. And so actually, I forget what will happen given this variable assignment, since we're going to print the variable here. I wonder if this will just error since this variable doesn't get assigned, since this code doesn't get run. See, I guess that's my guess, is that there is an error. Yeah, object X is not found. So I'm just going to comment this out for now. All right, so you can see that the code is included, but there's no output because the code wasn't evaluated. Well, after eval, another good chunk option to know about is echo. The default value is true, but if you say echo equals false, then the output of the R code chunk will be included in the document, but the code won't be included in the document, right? So this is actually like probably one of the most useful R code chunk options to know about, because oftentimes, you'll be presenting a document to one of your collaborators, and like they don't necessarily care about the code that you wrote. They don't necessarily care about the code, the R code specifically that you wrote, right? But they do care about a plot, a table, whatever like the output of that R code is. Therefore, if you are like creating a document to show them in our Markdown, you can say echo equals false. That hides all the R code from them, and all they see are the outputs, right? The pretty figures or tables that you're creating, or whatever it is that you're creating. So if I knit this, yeah, you can see that it's interestingly, yeah. So none of the code is included, but since this message is an output, that is included, and the figure is included, right? So if you are sick of this, if you're sick of all the text that tidyverse generates, which I often am, we're going to add another code chunk here with a comma, and we're going to say message equals false. So this will suppress all messages that are produced by an R code chunk. Let me knit that. Here we can see that the tidyverse messaging went away. Similarly, you can say like warning equals false. This will suppress any warning. So if I say like, so I guess before I might have had a warning like, normally you would write you wouldn't actually write warning in an R code chunk, right? you would write some R function, it might produce a warning. And if you want to suppress that warning, then you can do that here, right? So if I say warning equals true, which is the default, then it'll show this warning that says this is bad. Yeah, there's the warning. But if I say equals false and did it again, then it will suppress that warning. Which, is useful. Sometimes R throws warnings, sometimes, especially like using certain like data analysis package, the analysis package is appropriately warning you of of something that's going on with your data, or is, more appropriately warning you of some kind of behavior, but you have accounted for that, but you don't necessarily want to show that warning in like a document that you're presenting to someone else, right? All right, so that's a little bit about our code chunks. Another nice thing about our Markdown is that all of your R code doesn't have to like live in these code chunks necessarily. So for example, I'm going to change up part 3 here and say the value of variable X. So this is something that we haven't gone over in terms of Markdown syntax. So in Markdown, if you want to write inline code, you do it with backticks on either side of the piece of code, right? So I also want to say here, like, a cool function is down right? So let's render this just to look at this Markdown syntax, how this looks. So you can see that with one backtick inline, it gives you the same like fixed width coding font as it does with 3 backticks in a code chunk. But what's really cool is that you can actually execute R code inline with these single backticks. So I'm gonna have 2 backticks. Then if I write R, I can like arbitrarily I can write any R code that I want in this line, right? So I'm going to say the value of the variable X is, and then I'm just going to say R to indicate to our Markdown that this line is actually going to get evaluated as R code. So I'm going to say just X, right? Because it's going to evaluate the value of X. And then I'm going to say, and X squared is, and then I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to say R just as an example to show you off, to show off what you could write in line. So I'm going to say R and then X squared, right? So we're assigning X up here, and then this is all going to happen in part 3. So anywhere where I write R, these short lines of R code are going to get executed. Of course, they could be longer, but this is just an example. So knit this. Okay, and then you can see on the bottom, it says, value variable X is 5, and X squared is 25. Right, which is neat. If I change this to be 10, and I knit it again, then it's updated automatically every time I knit it. Which is interesting. So, so you can see, these are very simple examples, but you can see how if you, start off with a big data set, you can have prose within a document that kind of like writes itself, that writes itself, right? If you want to, always like report a specific value from that data, you can do it automatically within and our Markdown document. Um, all right, we did some inline R. I can talk. I'm going to skip talking about parameterization and our Markdown render just to kind of, we've only got a couple minutes left. I just want to show off some other functionality of our Markdown. So, of course, the kinds of, in your collaborations with folks, people work in, many different kinds of documents. So, I've been compiling everything to HTML during this little workshop, but you can also compile things, for example, to Word. So I'm going to click next to knit on this drop-down menu and say knit to Word. It automatically gives me a nicely formatted Word file with all this information. So if you're working with folks who are used to working in with Microsoft tools, this is a nice way to like get your R, the outputs of your R analysis into that ecosystem. There's also here I want to show off like there's an R package called articles. So I know lots of folks, and in fact I've done this myself, where I've written academic papers using R Markdown, and they have a on the GitHub page for this package they have like all of the different journals and conferences, all different like journal and conference formats, where you just write an R Markdown document like I've been showing you, and it gets compiled perfectly into the formatting that these different venues want, right? Which is really nice. This requires like some LaTeX stuff, which actually the R Markdown folks have made relatively easy to install. Like I said, I'm working on a new machine, so I don't have. I would demo more of that, but I don't have it set up on this machine correctly yet. The other thing that you can make with R Markdown that's really interesting is that you can have you can even make like slide presentations. So there's a great like HTML and JavaScript slide framework called Reveal, and it's this is like a very basic R Markdown document for creating one of these Reveal docs. In fact, let's copy this and see if we can just render it. And now we're going more off script. So what's nice about, let me slow down a little bit. So, I came up here to start a new R Markdown. I came up here to File, New File, R Markdown. And then a lot of these packages come with templates, right? So I installed Reveal.js earlier. And if I click on from template on the left here, you can see that there's like a Reveal.js template. So I'm going to select that and click OK. And it sets me up with like a basic Reveal.js document here. So if I knit this, let's see, I'm going to call this test. Yeah, if I knit this, then it creates this very, I don't know if I like this transition style necessarily. I'm sure there are other transition styles that I can choose, but you can see that just, by writing the kind of our Markdown document that we've been talking about for the past hour, there's nothing super exotic in this R Markdown document. You could create a really neat set of like HTML-based slides, which of course is easy to share if you put it on the internet. And I also wanted to plug at the end here, so, what our package that I've written is called postcards. And what you can do with postcards, so, of course, I installed postcards a couple minutes before this workshop. So I'm going to do exactly what I did with reveal, right? So I'm going to come up here to file, new file, R Markdown. I'm going to make this new R Markdown from a template. And what's nice about postcards is that you can create kind of your own like single page personal website is kind of the idea, right? So I'm going to choose trestles. They're different. Their postcards comes with 5 different templates. Click OK. And then I'm just gonna knit this. It comes with like a like some filler text and filler information that you can edit. Of course, so the YAML front matter is a little bit more complicated, but not that bad. Call this test postcards. Save that. Yeah, so the idea is, I'm surprised that photo didn't get copied, but the idea is that you can have a photo of yourself here and write your name, have some like relevant links, and write like a short bio and a little bit about yourself. Here, I don't know why this photo didn't come up, but a better example of that is like, let's see. Here, this is what it's supposed to look like. Yeah. And what it should look like. No one has complained about this yet, so, but that's good to know. I need to look into that. Okay, well, we're at the end here. I probably should have left a little bit more time. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk. I don't know how much time folks have. And I will, I'll be posting this video relatively soon. And I'll post about it in Slack and stuff, in case you want to look back at a part of it or something like that. But yeah, thanks so much for coming. I'm going to stop the video now.